Between roughly 1 AD and 1450 AD, an entire civilization thrived in this stretch of Sonoran desert, built more than 130 miles of hand-dug irrigation canals across a valley that receives barely 8 inches of rain a year, developed sophisticated pottery, ball courts, and platform mounds across 5 distinct cultural periods spanning nearly a millennium and a half, and then, for reasons archaeologists still actively debate to this day, simply vanished entirely, leaving nothing behind but crumbling adobe ruins and an empty, abandoned canal system, slowly filling with wind-blown sand over the following 4 centuries. 400 years later, a former Confederate soldier looked at those same abandoned ditches, still faintly visible as shallow depressions cutting across the desert floor, and saw not a warning from history, but a genuine opportunity. Today, the city he helped found is the 5th largest in the entire United States, home to more than 1.6 million residents within its own municipal boundaries, and nearly 5 million people across its full metropolitan area, built almost entirely in a desert so fundamentally hostile to human life that, on the worst days of an average summer, simply stepping outside, unprotected for too long, can be genuinely medically fatal. This is the story of Phoenix, Arizona, a city that was named quite deliberately and quite self-consciously after a mythical bird that rises reborn from its own ashes, and whose entire 160-year history has been one long, increasingly urgent argument about whether that particular myth actually has an expiration date built into it. The valley's first great civilization was the Hohokam, a name later applied to them by other native peoples who encountered only their abandoned works, a term that translates roughly to those who have gone, or those who have vanished. For well over 1,000 years, beginning around the start of the Common Era, the Hohokam built and continuously maintained an irrigation network along the Salt and Gila rivers, so extensive and so sophisticated in its engineering that portions of its original canal alignments remain, in heavily modified and modernized form, in active agricultural and municipal use today, nearly 2,000 years after they were first excavated by hand. Archaeologists divide the Hohokam presence in the valley into several distinct periods, beginning with an early pioneer era characterized by shallow, simple pit houses and gradually more complex canal networks, progressing through a colonial period that saw the emergence of decorated pottery and ceremonial ball courts, a sedentary period marked by larger, more permanent settlements and platform mounds, and finally a classic period, lasting roughly from 1150 to 1450 AD, during which the civilization's remaining settlements grew noticeably larger and more centralized, even as the total number of individual villages across the valley measurably declined, a pattern archaeologists interpret as a society consolidating its resources in the face of mounting environmental or social stress. Sometime around 1450 AD, the Hohokam civilization collapsed entirely and relatively abruptly, its population dispersing, dying off or assimilating into other regional groups across what researchers now believe was some combination of prolonged, punishing multi-decade drought, catastrophic flooding events that periodically overwhelmed and destroyed the very canal systems the Hohokam had spent centuries building and depended on entirely for their food supply, and the kind of slow, grinding agricultural and soil exhaustion that eventually undoes any civilization that has spent centuries pushing right up against the absolute limits of what a fixed, finite regional water supply can realistically sustain. When later Akamel O'Adam and other native peoples migrated through or settled in the same valley generations afterward and encountered the abandoned canals, the crumbling platform mounds, and the scattered ruins the Hohokam had left behind them, they gave the vanished builders the only name that seemed to genuinely fit what they were looking at: the people who have gone. More than 4 centuries later, in 1867, a Civil War veteran, prospector, and sometime outlaw named Jack Swilling stopped to rest his horse on a ridge at the foot of the White Tank Mountains overlooking the Salt River Valley, and noticed something in the rich, dark soil his horse's hooves had turned up that convinced him the seemingly barren, sun-scorched desert floor spread out below him could actually support genuine agriculture, if only it could somehow be reliably supplied with water. Returning to the nearby mining boomtown of Wickenburg, Swilling organized a group of local investors into the Swilling Irrigation Canal Company and led a small party of settlers back into the valley, where they began the considerably less glamorous, far more labor-intensive work of clearing out and physically extending the ancient, centuries-abandoned, sand-choked Hohokam canals, rather than attempting to dig entirely new channels from scratch, since the prehistoric engineers who came before them had already identified, through long trial and error, the single most efficient possible routes for moving water across the valley's very gentle, almost imperceptible natural slope. Using largely Mexican laborers recruited for the physically brutal work, Swilling's company had a functioning canal roughly 7 miles long completed by March 1868, and water was soon flowing through it to irrigate a small farming colony that had taken root a few miles east of where downtown Phoenix stands today, a settlement residence initially called Swilling's Mill, then Helling Mill, then Mill City, and eventually simply East Phoenix, as the town's actual center of gravity shifted westward over the following years. Swilling himself, a former Confederate soldier with a documented fondness for whiskey and laudanum that would eventually contribute to his own downfall and imprisonment on unrelated charges years later, initially wanted to name the fledgling settlement Stonewall in open tribute to the Confederate General Stonewall Jackson, a choice that predictably found little enthusiasm among the settlement's more Union-sympathetic residents, while other early colonists floated the alternative name Salina instead, referencing the region's mineral-heavy soil. Neither name satisfied the assembled group. It was one of Swilling's own fellow settlers, an English-born adventurer named Darrell Duppa, who ultimately suggested a name that would prove considerably more enduring than either alternative: Phoenix, after the mythical bird of ancient legend that burns entirely to ash and then rises reborn from the very wreckage of its own destruction, a description Duppa felt captured with real precision exactly what this new farming settlement represented: a second civilization quite literally rising from the physical, abandoned foundations of the first one's total collapse centuries earlier. By January 1868, the name Phoenix was already in common local use, and a small post office opened under that name later the same year, formally cementing the settlement's identity for good. Phoenix grew steadily rather than explosively through its first decade and a half of existence, reaching a documented population of roughly 2,500 residents by the time it formally incorporated as an official city in 1881, a modest but genuine milestone for a settlement that, barely 14 years earlier, had consisted of nothing more than a handful of families clearing out a single rehabilitated irrigation ditch. The young city further cemented its growing regional importance in 1889, when territorial officials formally designated it the capital of the Arizona Territory, displacing the previous, more established territorial capital of Prescott. A political victory that brought additional government offices, additional railroad investment, and a meaningful boost to Phoenix's standing relative to its regional rivals. But the young city's own leaders understood, with a clarity that would come to define nearly every subsequent chapter of Phoenix's entire history right up through the present day, that agriculture and population growth alike remained entirely hostage to a water supply the Salt River itself could never reliably guarantee on its own terms. The river ran in wild, genuinely unpredictable extremes from one season to the next, violent flash floods in some years, capable of washing out entire sections of carefully constructed canal in a matter of hours, followed by stretches of near-total crop-killing dryness, in other years that left irrigated fields withering on the exact same land that, only months earlier, had been at serious risk of drowning under floodwater instead. Phoenix's farmers, recognizing that no group of private settlers could ever hope to finance the kind of large-scale flood control and water storage infrastructure the valley genuinely needed, organized themselves into the Salt River Valley Water Users Association, specifically to lobby the federal government for exactly this kind of ambitious public works assistance. And their timing, as it turned out, proved genuinely fortunate. President Theodore Roosevelt signed the National Reclamation Act into law in 1902, opening up substantial new federal funding specifically for large-scale Western water projects of precisely this kind. And construction began the following year, in 1903. On a dam that would permanently transform the entire valley's relationship with its own unpredictable river. Theodore Roosevelt Dam, an arch-gravity structure built almost entirely from hand-laid masonry stone, hauled at considerable expense to a remote canyon construction site that itself first required building an entirely new access road just to reach, rose to a height of 284 feet and stretched more than 2,200 feet across a narrow gorge on the Salt River, creating, upon its eventual completion, the largest artificial lake anywhere on Earth at that particular moment in engineering history. Construction dragged on for 8 full years, repeatedly delayed by seasonal flooding that periodically washed away expensive materials and equipment before crews could get them safely into place, but Roosevelt himself nonetheless traveled personally to the remote, difficult-to-reach dedication site on March 18, 1911, pressing a ceremonial button that released a jet of water thundering down the canyon in front of roughly 1,000 onlookers who had made the long, dusty journey specifically to witness what one contemporary newspaper account described, without much exaggeration, as a spectacle the American West, and quite possibly the entire country, had genuinely never seen the likes of before. The dam, along with several additional dams built on the Salt and Verde Rivers over the following decades of continued federal investment, finally gave Phoenix's farmers a stable, genuinely controllable, year-round water supply capable of reliably irrigating more than 30,000 individual farms scattered across the valley, transforming the entire region almost overnight into a genuine agricultural powerhouse, supplying winter vegetables, cotton, citrus, and grain to markets across the entire American West and beyond. Phoenix's own population, which had stood at a modest 10,000 residents the year before the dam's completion, very nearly tripled to 29,053 residents by the 1920 federal census, a growth rate that finally gave the young desert capital genuine, self-sustaining economic momentum for the very first time in its existence. The next transformation arrived not from another massive engineering project, but from a comparatively simple mechanical innovation that finally addressed the other, arguably more punishing half of Phoenix's fundamental problem. Not merely the underlying shortage of reliable water, but the sheer, unrelenting brutality of the desert heat itself. Evaporative cooling systems, colloquially and enduringly known as swamp coolers, spread rapidly through Phoenix homes and businesses during the 1920s, ingeniously exploiting the desert's own extreme atmospheric dryness by drawing hot outdoor air across water-soaked cooling pads and allowing rapid evaporation to lower the air's temperature substantially before circulating it indoors through simple fans and ductwork, a technology considerably cheaper to both install and operate than genuine mechanical refrigeration, though only partially effective during the valley's brief but genuinely humid summer monsoon season, when the evaporative cooling process itself becomes measurably less efficient. True refrigerated air conditioning arrived commercially in Phoenix through the following decade, the 1930s, proving markedly more reliable than swamp coolers regardless of prevailing outdoor humidity levels, and Phoenix's population climbed to 65,414 residents by the 1940 census, clear evidence that a genuinely comfortable, climate-controlled indoor environment, however expensive it remained to install and continuously operate, could finally make sustained year-round desert living genuinely appealing even to newcomers who possessed no prior ancestral agricultural or economic tie to the region whatsoever. World War II delivered Phoenix's next decisive growth catalyst, and it arrived largely by wartime military necessity rather than by any deliberate civic economic development strategy. The Army Air Forces, drawn specifically by the region's consistently clear skies, flat and largely unobstructed terrain, and near total year-round absence of the fog, low cloud cover, and severe winter weather that regularly grounded pilot training flights elsewhere across the country, established a substantial cluster of major military airfields across the greater Phoenix area during the war years, including Luke Field to the west and Williams Field to the southeast, facilities that together trained tens of thousands of American pilots for eventual combat deployment across both the European and Pacific theaters. A great many of those same young servicemen hailed originally from the considerably colder, grayer, more industrial cities of the American Midwest and Northeast, and they spent months of intensive training under Arizona skies that, whatever the genuinely punishing summer heat those same skies also produced, offered a kind of relentless, near-permanent, cloudless sunshine that most of these young men had simply never before experienced for an entire uninterrupted season at a stretch back home. A meaningful share of those same wartime trainees, once the fighting in both theaters finally ended, made the deliberate personal decision to return permanently to the Phoenix area rather than go back to the harsh winters they had grown up enduring, bringing with them new families, new industrial and technical skills acquired during their military service, and, perhaps most crucially of all, for the region's long-term economic trajectory, entirely new consumer demand for exactly the kind of mass-produced post-war suburban housing that developers across the entire country were already racing to build as quickly as possible. That distinctive wave of wartime exposure combined powerfully with the following decade's rapidly falling cost of residential air conditioning to produce genuinely explosive, sustained population growth throughout the entire 1950s. Hundreds of individual manufacturing firms relocated significant portions of their operations to the greater Phoenix area during this single decade alone, drawn by consistently cheap available land, a largely non-unionized regional labor pool that appealed strongly to corporate executives looking to escape more heavily unionized industrial states, and an aggressively pro-business local political establishment eager to court exactly this specific kind of corporate relocation through generous tax incentives and minimal regulatory friction. By 1960, fully half of Arizona's entire statewide population lived within the Phoenix metropolitan area alone, a striking level of internal population concentration that few other American states of comparable size could match anywhere else in the country. Motorola established a major, long-lasting research and semiconductor manufacturing presence in the valley during these same years, soon followed by a steady stream of additional electronics, defense, and aerospace firms drawn by that same powerful combination of favorable year-round climate, abundant available land for expansive corporate campuses, and consistently pliable local politics, and Phoenix's own civic and economic identity began shifting dramatically within barely a single generation's time, from a regional agricultural capital irrigated by Roosevelt Dam's newly reliable water supply into a genuinely diversified, rapidly industrializing Sunbelt metropolis whose sheer population growth increasingly began to outpace even that same carefully engineered water supply's original 1911 design capacity. It was precisely that steadily widening mismatch between explosive population growth and a comparatively fixed regional water supply that drove Phoenix's next truly great engineering undertaking, a project that would ultimately dwarf even the already impressive Roosevelt Dam in both sheer physical scale and underlying financial ambition. Arizona's two enormously powerful and influential United States senators of the era, Carl Hayden and Barry Goldwater, spent the better part of 2 full decades lobbying their fellow members of Congress for federal authorization and full construction funding to build an entirely new, wholly separate water delivery system capable of physically carrying Colorado River water more than 300 miles across open desert terrain directly to both Phoenix and Tucson, a project whose sheer engineering audacity genuinely rivaled anything California, Nevada, or any other Colorado River Basin state had previously attempted with their own respective legal shares of the same increasingly contested river. Congress finally passed the Colorado River Basin Project Act in 1968, after years of difficult negotiation with rival basin states, formally authorizing what became known as the Central Arizona Project. And construction proceeded across the following decade and a half in carefully sequenced stages, ultimately at a total cost that would eventually exceed $4 billion in cumulative federal investment. The completed system's centerpiece, the aptly named Hayden Roads Aqueduct, stretches an extraordinary 190 miles from Lake Havasu on the California border all the way through the entire heart of metropolitan Phoenix, relying on an intricate network of massive pumping plants, including one facility that lifts water an almost unbelievable 824 vertical feet straight out of the lake using 6 individual pumps, each rated at a staggering 66,000 horsepower apiece, before the water continues its long overland journey through several miles of tunnels bored directly through solid desert mountain rock. The Central Arizona Project's core Phoenix area deliveries were substantially completed by 1985, finally giving the metropolitan area a genuinely second, entirely independent major water source beyond the original Salt and Verde River system. Roosevelt Dam had first successfully tamed some 74 years earlier, and today more than 1.8 million individual residents across the greater Phoenix area depend, at least in significant part, on Colorado River water, physically carried across nearly 200 miles of open desert by a canal and tunnel system whose sheer engineering scale would have seemed like pure, unimaginable science fiction to Jack Swilling's small original party of settlers, laboriously rehabilitating a handful of ancient irrigation ditches entirely by hand back in 1868. Picture Phoenix on a warm summer evening, sometime in the early 2000s, near the absolute peak of one of the single most sustained residential and commercial building booms in the entire history of American urban development. Fresh subdivisions spread relentlessly outward from the city's original historic core in literally every possible direction. Thousands upon thousands of nearly identical stucco homes, topped with matching red tile roofs and small backyard swimming pools, rising steadily on raw desert land that, barely a decade earlier, had supported nothing at all but scattered creosote bush, brittle bush, and towering saguaro cactus. An expansion so relentless and so sustained that Phoenix would, for a stretch of years running well into the 2020s, repeatedly hold the title of the single fastest growing large metropolitan region anywhere in the entire United States. Manicured golf courses kept a vivid, almost artificially vibrant shade of green, straight through the punishing peak of a desert summer, dot the sprawling suburban landscape in numbers that visitors, arriving from wetter, greener climates elsewhere in the country, often find genuinely difficult to fully process or rationalize, each individual course drawing steadily on the exact same finite groundwater and imported canal water supply that every other resident, every business, and every remaining working farm across the entire valley depends on simultaneously and continuously. Air conditioning units hum audibly on virtually every single rooftop across the metro area. An infrastructure so completely, non-negotiably load-bearing to ordinary daily life here that any prolonged citywide power failure occurring during the genuine peak of a Phoenix summer represents not merely a passing inconvenience, but an immediate, genuinely life-threatening emergency for the metro area's most medically vulnerable residents. Out past the very newest subdivisions, still under active construction, in sparsely populated unincorporated stretches of outer Maricopa and Pinal County, where ambitious developers had already platted tens of thousands of additional future home lots on the confident, unexamined assumption that the region's underlying water supply would simply continue expanding indefinitely to meet whatever future demand eventually materialized. Nobody standing inside a builder's brand new model home on that particular summer evening has much reason at all to imagine that the state's own hydrologists, within only another 2 decades, would be forced to conclude, in the starkest possible official terms, that the surrounding desert simply could not physically support all of it after all. That long-deferred reckoning finally arrived in June 2023, when the Arizona Department of Water Resources publicly released the detailed results of a comprehensive groundwater modeling study covering the entire greater Phoenix metropolitan area, and reached a conclusion state officials themselves described, without much attempt at softening the underlying implications, as genuinely stunning. The region had already reached the anticipated practical limits of continued growth on its available groundwater supplies, with roughly 4.9 million acre-feet of total projected demand over the coming 100-year planning horizon, that existing, already heavily drawn-down groundwater reserves simply could not realistically meet under any remotely plausible future scenario the state's own modelers had tested. Arizona. Governor Katie Hobbs announced shortly afterward that the state would immediately, effective at once, stop issuing any further new assured water supply certificates, the essential legal precondition required before any brand new residential subdivision could legally break ground anywhere in the state, specifically to those proposed developments in outlying areas of the Phoenix metro that depended entirely on finite local groundwater rather than on renewable, replenishable surface water sources like the already completed Central Arizona Project canal system. The decision stemmed directly from a genuinely remarkable, decades ahead of its time piece of prescient state legislation, the 1980 Arizona Groundwater Management Act, which had required, more than 4 decades in advance of the exact crisis it was ultimately designed specifically to prevent, that any proposed new subdivision anywhere in the regulated area formally demonstrate a fully assured water supply lasting a complete 100 years before construction could legally begin, a planning horizon considerably longer and more genuinely rigorous than almost any other comparably fast-growing American state had ever bothered to legislate into permanent law. The resulting moratorium fell hardest of all on the rapidly expanding outer suburb of Buckeye, a community that had itself grown by a full 69% between the 2010 and 2020 census counts alone, where developers had already filed formal paperwork seeking water certification for roughly 300,000 additional individual home lots. At the exact moment the state's landmark decision finally came down, a genuinely staggering number that the initial round of dramatic national headlines, however alarming their overall framing, actually understated rather considerably in practice. Phoenix's own sitting mayor, Kate Gallego, pushed back publicly and forcefully against national media coverage. She felt unfairly cast the entire moratorium as clear evidence of civic and regional failure rather than genuinely responsible long-term foresight, telling reporters afterward in the immediate aftermath that the state's decision actually represented a fundamental planning strength rather than any kind of weakness, built around what she repeatedly described as a simple, guiding governing principle the region had long tried to follow: water first, and only then development. That particular framing captured something genuinely, demonstrably true about Phoenix's overall institutional approach to water management over the preceding half-century, an approach state and local officials alike have long pointed to, with real justification, as measurably more rigorous and more genuinely forward-looking than almost anywhere else across the rapidly growing, water-stressed American Southwest. It did not, however, meaningfully change the underlying hard arithmetic the 2023 groundwater study had so starkly exposed, nor did it fully address a second, arguably even more urgent and more immediately deadly crisis converging on the exact same metropolitan area at almost precisely the same moment in time. Extreme heat itself was killing Phoenix area residents in numbers that climbed without a single year's interruption or reprieve, for at least 6 consecutive summers running. Maricopa County's own Department of Public Health, which has tracked heat-associated deaths with unusual scientific rigor and consistency since the mid-2010s, specifically because the underlying scale of the problem had already become genuinely impossible to responsibly ignore or downplay any longer, recorded 425 confirmed heat-related deaths across the metro area in 2022 alone, a grim total that itself represented a brand new all-time record at the moment it was first reported. That particular record, unfortunately, did not last even a single additional year. The summer of 2023 brought the single longest sustained heat wave ever officially recorded anywhere in the Phoenix area's documented weather history, with high temperatures reaching or exceeding a punishing 110 degrees Fahrenheit on every single day running from June 30th all the way through July 30th, a full uninterrupted month without so much as a single day of meaningful thermal relief for residents. And by the time county public health officials finalized their detailed annual surveillance report that winter, the confirmed heat death toll for calendar year 2023 stood at a staggering 579 individual deaths, a full 50% increase over the previous year's already record-setting total, with elderly senior citizens accounting for roughly 1 in every 3 of the deceased, and nearly 45% of all identified victims subsequently found to have been unsheltered at the precise time of their deaths, sleeping behind commercial dumpsters, in open parking lots, or directly on exposed pavement that during the genuine peak of a typical Phoenix summer afternoon, can reliably reach surface temperatures easily capable of inflicting serious third-degree burns on any exposed human skin within mere seconds of sustained direct contact. The following year, 2024, brought yet another grim record, with more than 600 confirmed heat deaths recorded across the broader metro area, and Maricopa County's own public health medical director, Dr. Rebecca Sunenshine, noted publicly at the time, with evident and genuine professional exhaustion, that the county had now set a brand new heat death record in each and every one of at least the preceding 6 consecutive calendar years running. An unbroken escalating streak she personally described as a genuinely devastating ongoing trend that the entire region had not yet managed to find any effective, lasting way to meaningfully reverse, despite years of dedicated, well-funded public health intervention efforts. Phoenix's own municipal leadership has not, to its genuine credit, remained entirely passive in the face of this rapidly accelerating annual crisis. The city formally established a dedicated Office of Heat. Response and Mitigation in 2021, reportedly the very first position of its specific kind at any major American city government anywhere in the country, tasked directly with the difficult, resource-intensive work of expanding tree canopy coverage and constructing additional built shade structures, specifically within the city's hottest, most heat-vulnerable individual neighborhoods, areas which tend, with genuinely grim statistical consistency across study after study, to be precisely the same lower-income neighborhoods that also happen to carry the very least existing tree cover and the fewest available cooling resources of any part of the metro area. The underlying physics, working directly against those otherwise well-intentioned mitigation efforts, though, remained formidable, and, in some meaningful respects, genuinely self-inflicted by the region's own preceding decades of development choices. Decades of exactly the kind of low-density, pavement-heavy suburban sprawl that originally made Phoenix the single fastest-growing metropolitan area in the entire country have collectively created one of the single most severe urban heat island effects measured anywhere at any major American city, with vast expanses of asphalt roadway, poured concrete, and dark composite rooftops absorbing solar radiation throughout the day and then steadily radiating that stored heat back into the surrounding atmosphere long after sunset each evening, keeping overnight low temperatures within the city's dense urban core measurably higher, in some published peer-reviewed studies by 10 full degrees Fahrenheit or considerably more, than the surrounding undeveloped open desert experiences on that exact same calendar night, effectively denying residents, and particularly the chronically unsheltered population that remains statistically most acutely at risk of heat death, the meaningful overnight cooling relief that genuine desert climates have traditionally, reliably offered even during their very harshest daytime temperature extremes throughout recorded history. Governor Hobbs ultimately declared a formal statewide heat emergency in August 2023, but only after the record-breaking month-long heat wave itself had already fully run its entire punishing course, a response timeline state officials themselves later publicly acknowledged with some evident candor had simply been too slow to meaningfully help those already most at risk and the state's overall cooling center infrastructure, by the honest, on-the-record admission of local investigative reporting conducted at the time, remained significantly and demonstrably under-resourced relative to the true scale of documented need, with as few as a single dedicated overnight cooling center reportedly available across the entire sprawling metro area during some of the very worst, most dangerous stretches of that particular record-breaking summer. Phoenix today counts roughly 1.6 million residents within its own official city limits, making it comfortably the 5th largest city anywhere in the entire United States, while simultaneously anchoring a broader metropolitan area of nearly 5 million total people that continues adding substantial numbers of new residents faster than almost any other large American metro area. This, despite the twin, steadily converging pressures of a regional groundwater supply that state hydrologists have already formally declared insufficient to support genuinely unlimited continued growth, and an annual summer heat season that has now broken its own grim mortality record in every single year since at least 2019. Roosevelt Dam still stands today, subsequently expanded and structurally reinforced since its original 1911 dedication ceremony, still faithfully capturing salt river water exactly as it was originally engineered to do more than a full century ago. The Central Arizona Project's extensive canal system still carries Colorado River water across a full 190 miles of open desert terrain, an engineering achievement whose pumping stations alone consume enough raw electricity to power a small city all by themselves, simply to keep the water physically moving uphill against the unforgiving pull of gravity for the entire remarkable length of its journey. And beneath all of it, largely invisible and entirely unnoticed by the millions of ordinary residents whose daily lives nonetheless depend on it completely, an ancient regional aquifer that originally took many thousands of years to naturally accumulate continues drawing down at a sustained pace state. Officials themselves have now formally and publicly acknowledged the desert simply cannot indefinitely sustain water that, once fully withdrawn and used, may realistically take centuries or considerably longer to naturally replenish, even if all further withdrawal stopped completely as of today. Jack Swilling looked out at the visible ruins of a civilization that had, by every credible archaeological account available, eventually and catastrophically run out of exactly the same finite natural resource his own brand new settlement would go on to depend upon, just as completely and just as precariously, and he chose, quite deliberately, to name his new town after a mythical bird specifically renowned for rising reborn from precisely that same kind of total, seemingly final civilizational collapse. 160 years later, Phoenix has, across generation after generation of ever more ambitious engineering solutions, dams, aqueducts, and finally, air conditioning itself, genuinely proven that this particular myth can be sustained, quite remarkably, for a considerably longer stretch of time than almost anyone might have originally guessed. What the city's own hydrologists, its own public health officials, and its own steadily mounting annual record books of heat-related deaths increasingly suggest, without quite ever stating it in precisely these blunt terms, is that the surrounding desert, the Hohokam once mastered so completely and then ultimately lost everything to has never actually stopped keeping careful score in the intervening centuries, and that Phoenix, for all its gleaming glass office towers and immaculately maintained golf courses, remains, in the most literal and immediate sense available, still living entirely on borrowed time and borrowed water in exactly the same fundamentally finite desert valley where an earlier, equally confident civilization already discovered, in agonizing detail, precisely how that particular story tends to end.